Hello, everyone. So we apologize for the delay, but we are streaming. So thank you to our fabulous tech team. So it's the first time this has happened in a forum, so we apologize and thanks for, everybody's patience. So I'm Lisa Krauser. I'm the Edward W. Kane Executive Director here at the Concord Museum, and thank you all for joining us for tonight's forum, Concord Birds Then and Now. So I'm delighted to introduce our speakers tonight. Richard Premack and Amanda Gallinat have been looking at the effects of climate change on the plants and birds of Concord, combining the historical records of Thoreau, Hosmer, Brewster, Griscom, Corey, and others with modern observations. Most recently, those modern observations entail using eBird data from Concord to extend the observations to the present. When organizing this program with Richard, he enticed us by saying the results so far are actually quite exciting and unexpected. So of course we wanted to go forward with the forum to find out more of those results. So for the first part of the forum, Richard and Amanda will present their research on Concord birds. Then they will be joined in a panel discussion with Jeff Collins, who's the Senior Director of Conservation Science at Mass Audubon and Concord resident, David Swain and Kathy Dia, both avid birders in Concord, and Peter Alden, naturalist, Concord resident, and author of 15 books on North American and African wildlife. So Richard Premack is a professor of plant ecology at Boston University with research interests in conservation biology, climate change biology, citizen science, and tropical rainforests. He has published over 200 scientific papers and carried out extensive fieldwork in Malaysia, New Zealand, Japan, Central America, the US, and other countries. He has served as the president of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation, and is an honorary fellow of that society. He has current appointments as a distinguished overseas professor at the Northeast Forestry University in China and a Humboldt Research Awardee in Germany. He's the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Biological Conservation and author of 2 widely used textbooks, Essentials of Conservation Biology and a Primer of Conservation Biology, for which 34 foreign language editions have been produced with local co-authors adding in examples from their own countries, so quite an accomplishment. He's also co-author of the book Tropical Rainforests, an Ecological and Biogeographical Comparison. So for the past 21 years, Professor Premack and his colleagues have been investigating the effects of a warming climate on the plants and birds of Massachusetts, with an emphasis on continuing the observations made 160 years ago by Henry David Thoreau in Concord. The work has also included experimental investigations of the environmental triggers of leaf out using dormant twigs, and the establishment of an international network of botanical gardens to monitor leaf out times in the spring and leaf, I'm not going to say it, senescence times in the autumn. So many of you will remember the Concord Museum's 2013 exhibition, Early Spring, Henry Thoreau and Climate Change, in which Professor Premack contributed as a guest scholar. We're excited to work with him on an upcoming exhibition, Harvest Seasons, for 2024. Harvest Seasons will explore the layers of history embedded in the landscape surrounding the Concord Museum. This land has a rich and complex history that spans indigenous presence, agricultural labor, and ongoing efforts to trace climate change. By pairing historical objects with contemporary perspectives from environmental history, indigenous art and activism, and ecological research, this exhibition will offer new ways of interpreting this land and its continuing meaning today. So we look forward to welcoming you all to that exhibit and the related programming when it happens. So Dr. Amanda Gallinat is a visiting assistant professor in environmental studies at Colby College. Her research uses field observations of plants and birds, historical records, and broad-scale ecological networks to examine how climate change is shifting the timing of seasonal biological events in New England's forests and beyond. She's received her BA in biology from Carleton College and her PhD in ecology, behavior, and evolution with her certificate in terrestrial biogeosciences at Boston University. From 2018 to 2021, she was a postdoc at Utah State University and is an instructor and student research mentor at Colby College, Carleton College, BU, and Utah State University, where she's conducted field and lab research, analyzing local to national scale ecological data, and designing courses and projects to benefit students in and out of the classroom. I also want to thank Mass Audubon for co-sponsoring the forum tonight and for everyone joining us both in person and virtually. Thank you for your patience with the delay. And our deepest gratitude to Professor Premack, Dr. Gallinat, and all of our panelists. So, thank you.
Well, Thanks very much for that introduction. It's great to be here. I see so many familiar faces there, so many people I've interacted with through the years. It's a great pleasure to be here. So just a little bit about the organization of the talk. So I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then Amanda will talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have our panelists make brief comments about what they think of what we've presented, and then we have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So that's what we will keep to, and I think that should result in a good program for tonight. So what we're presenting to you tonight is the most recent research which we've done on an ongoing project to investigate the effects of climate change on the plants and animals of Concord, Massachusetts. And so this is something that is very relevant because we're in the Concord Museum, and many of you are residents of Concord, and many of you have even contributed insights to us and information which we're going to be presenting to you today. Also, it has this very special quality because a number of my former students are here who also worked on this project, and I will mention you as we sort of present the talk tonight. So this talk is led by Amanda Gallinet and myself. Also, just recently, former BU undergraduate, Karina Terry, has helped us with this analysis. But again, the work which we're presenting tonight isn't just our work, it's work of many former graduate students of mine, many undergraduates from Boston University, many colleagues from other institutions, and also many Concord residents. And again, I see a number of you here tonight. So many people have contributed to us, have shown us where to find plants and birds. Many people have contributed observations. And we could not have done this without not only the legacy of Thoreau, but also the people of Concord. So when we read the book Walden, the famous book by Thoreau, you can read the book Walden so many different ways, but when we read Walden, and I've probably read it 25 times in the last 15 years, and when I read Walden now, and when I teach it to my students, I regard the book Walden as a manual of how to address climate change. So in the book Walden, Thoreau tells us to observe nature carefully. And he said we should observe nature carefully because we can get lessons of life. But if you observe nature carefully in Walden or in Concord or really anywhere, you will see the effects of climate change. You will see that the plants and animals are changing in response to a changing climate. A second lesson of the book Walden is Thoreau tells us to live simply. He tells us to live simply because if we live simply, we will be healthier, better people, and also we won't have to work as hard. But if we live simply, this is also the way of addressing the problem of climate change. If we don't use as much material possessions, if we don't use as much energy, then this is really the way to address the problem of climate change. And he also, in his book, he tells us to affect society. And in his time, the great injustices were slavery and war. And those problems are still with us today. But we also have this additional problem of climate change. And if Thoreau was alive today, he would probably tell us that we should become engaged in this issue which threatens all of humanity. And in the case of my students and I, we've been investigating climate change in many locations around Massachusetts and the world, but with a special focus on Concord. And in my case, I've tried to take all the work that my students and I have done and put it in this popular book, Walden Warming. So if you're looking for the effects of climate change, Massachusetts is a particularly good place to study climate change because first we have extremely good weather records at Blue Hills Observatory. And if you look at the weather records from Blue Hills, the records go back to the 1840s, and we have a lot of information about how the climate has changed, but also the climate has changed a lot. So the Massachusetts area has warmed by about 2 degrees centigrade already over the last 150 years, and we've had as much warming, about 4 degrees Fahrenheit. This is more warming than almost any other place in the United States. And so it's a good place to study climate change because you can see these very strong warming effects. Also, another advantage of working in New England is that we have extremely variable weather. So we have warm years and cold years, which gives it that very spiky look to it, and that means that we can compare cold years and warm years within a particular period of time, which makes it very advantageous for climate change research. So when we study climate change in New England, we're mostly talking about a warming climate, but there are also other effects of climate change also. So rainfall patterns are changing, and New England is actually getting wetter over time. Another effect of climate change is rising sea levels, and the sea level has risen by about 10 inches on the New England coast. So we've had this quite dramatic rise in sea level, and also CO2 levels are rising. So CO2 levels are one of the drivers of climate change, but it's also an essential nutrient that plants need, so plants are likely also changing in response to this rising CO2 level. And I'm sure everyone in the audience knows that climate change is caused by people burning fossil fuels like oil, coal, and natural gas, and also burning tropical rainforests, and this increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere acts like a blanket, keeping heat closer to the Earth's surface. So when we as ecologists are looking for the effects of climate change, there are a number of key indicators that we look for. One is changing in the phenology of species, that is the timing of events like when plants flower in the spring. Another indicator is the distribution of species, because species like birds that are very mobile might be able to migrate higher in elevation on mountains, or might be able to migrate further north. And then the third indicator of climate change is the changing abundance of species, because there are some species which might like warm temperatures and get more abundant, and there are other species which don't like warm temperatures and will start to die out. So these are what we're looking for. And the way in which we approached this subject, in which we really began looking at this 20 years ago, was to find old records. You try to find old records of someone observing one of these indicators, and then ideally they've continued to observe it up until the present time, or you find old records, and then you start making the modern observations yourself. And of all the records that we found in all of our extensive searching all around Boston and Massachusetts and other places, the best records that we found are here in Concord, Massachusetts. So these were records that were established by Henry David Thoreau in the 1850s. So in the 1850s, Thoreau went out and started recording the flowering times of over 300 plant species, leafing out time, bird arrival times, and these are really the most extensive old records that we have found anywhere in the United States, and often these records have been continued by modern naturalists. So this is something incredible here in Concord, which isn't present really anywhere else in the United States. And so in black here is a table of Thoreau's. So Thoreau made these tables up in the 1850s, and this is one of his tables from 1857. So May of 1857, he wrote down when he first saw particular plants flowering. So on May 1857, on the 14th of May, he recorded these particular plants first flowering in Concord. And so you can see he wrote high blueberry, which we would now call high bush blueberry. So he wrote the first flowering of this plant, and then we have a picture of this plant, and we're monitoring the same species in Concord today. So this is a very unique record. By the way, his writing is in black, my writing is in blue. And so it's a very, very unique record that he kept. And beginning in 2003, Abe Miller-Rushing, you want to raise your hand, Abe? So Abe Miller-Rushing and I, along with many BU undergraduates and then later other BU graduate students, we began monitoring plants in Concord in the same way that Thoreau did. We wandered all around Concord trying to find the first open flower of that species that we could find anywhere in Concord. So we looked for plants like bird's foot violet in Mount Auburn Cemetery, or lady slipper orchid in the Bristers Woods. And so we looked for the first flowering just the same way that Thoreau did. We found that there was another naturalist named Alfred Hosmer, who from 1878 to 1902 also was recording the first flowering times of plants in Concord. And this is a picture of what we get from all this analysis. So if we look on this axis, the x-axis from 1840s to the present time, and on the y-axis we have dates in the spring, we have observations made by Thoreau, Hosmer, and then Abe Miller-Rushing and myself, along with many other people since then. And each one of these dots here, each one of these symbols represents the average flowering time of 32 common spring wildflower species that Thoreau, Hosmer, and we saw every year. And so you can see there's a lot of points. I just want to point out that each one of these points here represents a year of field work. So there's just a tremendous amount of work that goes into this figure here. And so if you look at Thoreau's values here, there's a lot of variation, but on average, that black cross represents the average of the averages. So in all of Thoreau's years, the wildflowers flowered around May 15th. In Hosmer's years, they flowered around May 11th. and in our years, they flowered around May 5th. So even though if you look at Concord and it seems very wonderful and idyllic and very colonial, in fact, plants have responded to climate change. Climate change is here in Concord, and the plants are flowering earlier now in Concord than they did in the past. And also just note these two particular years in which the flowering is extremely early. This is 2010 and 2012. And if instead of, okay, it's not advancing. Want to give me some help?
I'm just doing what you did, huh?
Uh-huh. There we go.
How about that?
Do it that way.
Okay,
Okay.
I'll leave this here.
Okay. So instead of presenting the data in terms of changes over time, we look at the average flowering time in relationship to spring temperature. So the x-axis now is the average temperature in the months of March, April, and May, and the y-axis is the same as we had before. These are the same data points. These are exactly the same data points, but instead of looking at changes over time, it's when plants flower in a particular year in relationship to the spring temperature, and you can see that the values fall all along this line here. So when it's a very cold spring on the left, when it's a very cold spring, the plants flower late, and when it's a very warm spring, the plants flower early. And then we highlight here the years of 2010 and 2012. These are these extraordinarily warm springs, and in that year with really warm springs, the plants flower off the charts early. So the reason that plants are flowering earlier doesn't have anything to do with rainfall or land use or other reasons. It has to do with temperature. Plants are flowering earlier now because it's warmer now. In addition to plants flowering earlier, we see a lot of changes in the abundance of plant species in Concord. So as we did our surveys of plant flowering times, we began to record the abundance of species, and we discovered that there were a surprisingly large number of wildflower species that Thoreau and later botanists saw in Concord, which we couldn't find or which have now become extremely rare. They've declined a lot in abundance. We concluded that about 27% of Concord's wildflower species, which were known historically, are not there any longer. Or, for example, plants like the purple fringed orchid have now become extremely rare. And that some of this loss we can relate to climate change. The species which, or climate change and flowering phenology. The species which have been disproportionately lost from Concord are species that are not able to shift their flowering times toward the earlier time of the year. And they also tend to be the cold-loving northern species. So we can relate some of the loss of wildflower species in Concord to climate change. We've also been monitoring leafing out times, and Carolyn Polgar, who was here earlier this evening but is not here right now. So Carolyn Polgar, for her PhD, she worked on leafing out times in Concord of trees. So during the 1850s, Thoreau also recorded the leafing out times of trees in Concord, and Carolyn and our research group repeated these observations of leafing out time of trees, and again, repeating Thoreau's observations. And for example, we look for sugar maples. This is actually looking at one particular sugar maple tree in Minuteman National Historical Site, and we so record when the new leaves appear on the tree in the same way that Thoreau did. And what we found is that trees are responding very rapidly to climate change, and they're responding more rapidly than the wildflowers. So the trees are now leafing out about 14 days or about 2 weeks earlier now than they did in Thoreau's time. So not only they're responding to climate change, but they're responding more rapidly than the wildflowers. And this means that if the trees are leafing out ever earlier in the spring, that they can potentially shade out the wildflowers. So this is what we call a phenological mismatch or a climate change mismatch between trees and wildflowers. So this is something which we first discovered here in Concord. No one had ever observed that anywhere else in the world. We observed that in Concord, building on Thoreau's legacy. And after we published our work, ourselves and a number of other research groups around the world began investigating this possibility of an ecological mismatch between trees and wildflowers. And this just shows 3 research groups between Eastern United States, Western Europe, and Eastern China, where people used museum specimens of plants called herbarium specimens. And looking at these museum specimens, they were able to determine when trees leafed out and when wildflowers were flowering in the past using these museum specimens, and they found that this phenomenon that we'd seen in Concord, Massachusetts, building on the records of Thoreau, is actually occurring throughout the eastern United States. The trees, throughout the eastern United States, trees are more responsive to climate change than wildflowers. So again, what we found here in Concord is actually a very general phenomenon. Concord also has an exceptionally rich legacy of migratory bird arrivals. So we had Thoreau making observations of migratory bird arrivals in Concord from 1851 to 1854. These observations of Thoreau were continued by William Brewster and a circle of his colleagues. They were continued in the early and mid-19th century by Ludlow Griscom. I should say William Brewster was a Concord resident as well as being an ornithologist. Griscom was a Concord resident and also an ornithologist. And then these records were continued from the mid-20th century on to the early 20th century by Rosita Corey, who was a Concord resident and also a school teacher. And so we had this extremely rich record of first arrival times in Concord, which is really unrivaled anywhere in the United States. And we took this data and we analyzed 22 common bird species for when they first arrived in all of these different data sets, when they arrived in relationship to time and into temperature. There were many methodological challenges of using this data because there were many missing values, and we had to spend a lot of time thinking about how to handle missing values in a large data set like this. But we eventually figured out a way to do this, and this was published with Libby Elwood as the lead author. When you raise your hand, Libby? So this was Libby Elwood as part of her PhD thesis. She analyzed this sort of data. She analyzed this data from Concord and published it in 2010 in Condor magazine. So what were some of the main conclusions of Libby's study? So one key result of this study is that if you look at the changes in arrival over time, so here we have the different data sets, Thoreau's data set, Brewster's data set, Griscom's data set. With Rosie Corey, there was actually a big break in her observations in the 1970s. So we divide her observations into Corey early observations before 1980, and then Corey observations after 1980, particularly after climate change began to become a factor. So we have these 5 data sets, and each one of these points here is a year of field work for each one of these people. So it's a lot of work in this figure here. And what this shows us here is that the birds are not changing over time. So in contrast to the wildflowers and the trees that are getting ever earlier in Concord, the birds aren't changing their arrival time based on this work that Libby came up with. However, if you look at changes in relationship to spring temperature, so again, we have the same axis from colder to warmer temperatures, birds arriving later or earlier, we can see that there is a trend toward earlier arrival time in warmer years and a later time in colder years. But the slope of this line is much weaker than for the trees and the wildflowers. So the birds are arriving about 1 day earlier for every 1 degree increase in temperature, but for the plants, for the wildflowers and the trees, it's about 3 or 4 days earlier for every 1 degree increase in temperature. So the birds are responding, but not as strongly. And that's shown when we put together all 3 lines together for these different groups of organisms. So again, if we look at spring temperature and arrival times, what we can see is that the trees shown in green here have a very strong slope. They're responding very strongly to climate change. Wildflowers are somewhat intermediate, and birds have the shallowest slope. So birds are responding to climate change, but much more weakly. So this is something that we came up with in Concord, and this has actually now been repeated by other observers who have similar kinds of data elsewhere in the country. And this is really a general phenomenon now that people realize is that birds are just not as responsive to climate change as plants and insects. But again, this was first found out in Concord and then generalized really in many other locations. When we published this study of Elwood's, the data only went up to 2007. And recently, Amanda and I had an article that came out in Living Bird about all of the work which we've done in Concord, but highlighting the work which we've done on birds. And as we wrote our article, we felt a little awkward because in this article, we were talking about what's happening to the birds in Concord, but our data really only went up to 2007. And this motivated us to try to update our study and to see whether we could find some way of finding a more recent set of observations which we could combine with these historical bird data sets. And so at that point, I'll turn it over to Amanda.
All right, hi. Just bear with me for one moment while we switch over here. It has to be plugged in, that's what we know. Let's see. Oh, that didn't work so well. Let's try again. Okay, hi. So we flipped a coin and I got the exciting job of telling you what we're doing now. So thanks, Richard, for that summary of the work that your lab and others have done to investigate the effects of climate change on plants and animals in Concord. I'll pick up where Richard left off, and I just want to start by echoing how unique the historical records here in Concord are for understanding the effects of climate change on the timing of seasonal events, and particularly for when we're thinking about for birds, these historical records from Thoreau, from Griscom, from Brewster and Corey are really unique in their historical value for understanding the effects of climate change. And so the limitation is that they end in 2007. And so I'll again say, we realized we didn't know what was happening with the birds over the last 15 years in Concord. And so we reached out to some very active local birders to ask the question, who is the next Thoreau or the next Brewster or Griscom or Corey? And if anyone wants to at any point suggest that they might be the next Thoreau, we're here to take the candidates. But we really wanted to know who might be recording first arrival dates for different bird species in Concord in the same way that these historical observers were doing. And when we reached out to the active local birders, so folks like Chris Van Dyke, Kathy Dia, David Swain, and Peter Alden, thank you all so much. We'll start thanking you now and continue thanking you for your help. There wasn't really one obvious person who came to mind who was recording first arrival dates for different species in the same way. It turns out that birding looks a little bit different in Concord now. So where before we had individual observers or a small handful of observers recording those first arrival dates, what birding in Concord looks like now is individuals or groups of birders going out together, making checklists of the birds that they're seeing, not necessarily the first arrival date, but all of the birds that they're seeing on a particular day in a particular location, and often submitting those checklists to eBird, the citizen science program that's run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. So who here submits checklists to eBird? Thank you. Thanks so much. I encourage those who are not doing so to join into that activity. But once your checklists are submitted to eBird, they're made available to other birders, but they're also made available to scientists around the world. And so it turns out that the Thoreau, the next Thoreau, is in fact the community of birders here in Concord, all of you together. And so we sort of set out to identify how we might use those eBird records to extend those historical records of first arrival dates in Concord for various species. And one of the things we learned, again from the help of our local birding experts, was that there were some sites that were more heavily birded than others. And so we found 9 target sites, including the Great Meadows National Wildlife Refuge, that is one of the most heavily birded sites in the state of Massachusetts. There are about 18,000 checklists for Great Meadows over the last 15 years, which is quite a lot. It puts it on par with sites like Mount Auburn Cemetery in Boston. And so I just want to say, again, we find that Concord is really this place that has such a rich tradition of natural history that allows us to start extending this data set into the present. So we found that there was enough data, an abundance of data from about 2013 to 2022 as eBird was sort of getting off the ground, and that we had data for 16 of the 22 species that were used in that historical analysis led by Libby Elwood. And what we did was we took all of this abundance of data and we were after that first arrival date. So the date that we really wanted out of each year for each species was the first time the bird of that species was seen, an individual was seen. So we took first arrival dates for 16 species over 10 years. And so we set about comparing our eBird data to the historical data. And you'll recall this figure from when Richard showed it to you a moment ago. Remember, each of these years represents, or each of these points represents a year. So lots of field work present in this figure. And when we added in the average for each year and across years for the eBird data, we were really pretty astonished by what we saw. The eBird records were significantly early compared to those historical records. And our first question was, is this the signal of climate change? Are birds arriving earlier now in the last 10 years than they were in these historical records? But we also knew that we needed to take into account the difference in methodology between the historical records and these eBird records. So is this just that we have a lot more observers who are more likely to see the first bird closer to the first arrival date? Or is this the signal of climate change? So you'll recall that Richard also showed you this result before, where we have our birds arriving earlier in warmer springs. And when we asked this question, is it the signal of climate change, we wanted to put our eBird data on the same axes. And we saw something really interesting when we did that. The first thing that I want to point out is that similar to the historical data, we see a significant relationship between arrival dates and mean spring temperatures in the eBird data. And we actually see a really similar response or similar slope of about 1 day advance per degree increase in temperature. But we also see that that relationship is offset. Those observations are, again, much earlier than they were in the historical observations. So in a year of comparable temperature, we see the eBird observers seeing birds about 8.35 days earlier. So this is the statistically significant difference between these two data sets. So you might also consider this that our historical observers were seeing birds 8 days later after they arrived in those years compared to the eBird observers. So what this means is that our eBird observers are recording their first arrival dates about 8 days earlier than historical observers. And this makes sense when we think about the difference in methodology, in sampling effort. If we have observers like Thoreau and Corey making their observations alone, we have Brewster and Griscom making their observations in combination with a small group of observers, which we've learned more about thanks to Dr. David Swain, who will be on the panel. But we have our eBirders going out in mass together and covering more sites, we actually have about 1,300 observers that have contributed to those eBird records over the last decade. So when we see actually a single year from our eBird records, that represents a whole lot of field work. And so we thought the simple way of accounting for this sampling difference to understand how bird arrivals have changed in the last 10 years is to use that correction factor to adjust the eBird records to be more similar to our historical records. So to account for that sampling bias in the eBird data so that we could compare it more effectively to our historical sample. So what we find when we account for that sampling bias of the sheer abundance of eBird observers is that eBird arrival dates are in fact similar to those observed by Rosita Corey in 1988 to 2007. But what is really valuable about being able to extend this analysis to include a larger sample and more recent data is that we now see, where before we did not see a change in arrival dates over time, we now have in that time period after 1980, birds arriving about 2 days earlier than they did before 1980. So we have more data and we're able to see that signal of change. We also see, when we account for that sampling difference, that our eBird data really sort of fit into our historical data a little bit more clearly, and that we maintain this relationship between first arrival dates and temperature of a sensitivity of about 1 day per degree increase in temperature. So those trends reflect all of those 16 species together, but extending the data using eBird records also allows us to continue analyzing and reanalyzing the signal of climate change for individual species. And when we do that, we find that compared to that historical analysis led by Libby Elwood, we mostly see that species level shifts are not dramatically changed by extending with the eBird data. The eastern phoebe, for instance, is still arriving about 2 days earlier per degree increase in temperature. The yellow warbler is still arriving about 1 day earlier with a degree increase in temperature. But we do see some species changing their trend with this extension of the data set. So for instance, the Baltimore oriole previously was thought to be arriving slightly earlier with warmer temperatures here in Concord, and now we don't see a significant trend. So I want to make sure we get to our panel. What do these results tell us? When we think about the Concord ecosystem, we're thinking about the ways that birds, plants, insects, and other organisms are all interacting with one another. And so we still see this signal of a shift toward earlier arrival times with warming temperatures of about 1 day per degree, and it still really pales in comparison to the shifts that we're seeing of closer to 3 to 6 days per degree increase with plants and insects. And so there is this risk that we'll see a mismatch between birds and the plants that they use for habitat, the insects that they use to feed their young, which we know is a really important indicator of population trends in the breeding grounds. And this is happening on top of a background of changes for birds that are resulting in population declines, primarily driven by losses in habitat in their range around the year. And so this is something that we really want to keep an eye on, keep investigating, keep monitoring, and we're able to do that because we have the ability to combine these historical and modern observations. And so we are really energized and encouraged by these sort of results that suggest we can do this kind of combination despite the methodological challenges and differences between these data sets, that here in Concord, yet again, we have a rich data set that we're able to use that makes this such a unique place for being able to investigate the effects of climate change on birds and other organisms. And that ecosystem connection, understanding the interactions between birds and other organisms, is nothing new here in Concord. I want to end with a quote from Henry David Thoreau, who saw these connections. In his journal, he wrote, "Insects and the smaller animals, as well as many larger, follow vegetation. If the buds are deceived and suffer from frost, then are the birds." So I want to say thank you. We would like to say thank you to the Concord community for collaborating with us on this. So special thanks to Peter Alden, Chris Van Dyke, Kathy Dia, David Swain, and other local birding experts who have helped us to navigate the not only the historical records of bird arrivals, but also these eBird records. Thanks to those of you who are recording observations through eBird. Please continue to do so. We need you. And if you are not currently part of that community but want to get involved, I encourage you to do so. It allows us to continue doing this climate change research. And thanks also to Libby Elwood, Abe Miller-Rushing, Trevor Lloyd Evans at Manomet, and Karina Terry and Emily Dang, who contributed to this analysis. And with that, I think we'd like to move on to our panel. Okay.
A couple of you up to. Okay. Lovely. We'll have to share the mic. Richard, can I put you up?
Okay. Maybe just.
Peter, can I clip you?
I think
We'll have to share.
people who are talking. Just,
Do we just pass it to whoever has it?
I mean, there's 6 of you, so that's kind of challenging. But, okay.
so,
Pass it around. Okay. Sounds
so
okay?
should we introduce the panelists? Or should we invite them? So I think that what we intended in this is that this is really a collaborative project between ourselves and Amanda and people at BU and also people in Concord. So we thought we would invite people from the Concord area and also people from the general bird community to just offer a couple of minutes of insights about what they think about this project and where it's going and, just what they think about it. So we can start off with probably the most talkative member of the group. A maximum of 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Well, anyways, wonderful job, you guys and gals. Wonderful job. Appreciate what you're doing. And you're bringing a lot of honor to Concord and a lot of honor to Henry David Thoreau. We welcome some people that I work with at Walden Pond here. I work at the shop at Walden. Walden Warming is available, I believe, at the Concord bookstore and at the shop of Walden. All right, this is interesting. I'm interested in plants. I'm no expert like Richard here. But it's interesting that I didn't see any mention in here of a problem on the wildflowers disappearing, which is overgrazing of deer, white-tailed deer. Remember, Henry Thoreau never, ever in his entire life saw a deer. You might have seen one in Maine, but I don't think so. And so some of the extinction may be due to climate change, and definitely is, and other things is the deer have eaten everything. I went down with a bunch of people from the American Museum of Natural History to West Virginia one April, and I was amazed at the wildflowers in the forests down there in West Virginia. It was fabulous. And you come up here to Concord, you don't see any wildflowers in the forest, hardly at all, a few lady slippers and things like that. And I asked some of those residents in some of those hollers down there in West Virginia, and I was amazed at the songbirds in the forest, I was amazed at all the wildflowers down there, and I said, what's the status of deer down here? And he says, well, we had a deer come in about 3 years ago, but we got him. And I know they're an overpopulation problem in much of suburbia here in the Northeast, and a real problem, but that is a factor in extinction there. Another thing that has intrigued to me when we saw the picture of the eastern phoebe coming north, a few days earlier with each degree of temperature change, and that's a bird that winters in the southern U.S. and around the northern Gulf of Mexico and so forth. But it was interesting to me that the Baltimore oriole, which winters much further south, it seems like the birds in South America and various areas further south, the longer distance migrants, are not coming north earlier because they're stuck in Peru or Ecuador or the Amazon or something. They don't know that things are warmer up here. And just one little tidbit that's very interesting, because we think on things like the eastern phoebe and other birds that sort of winter. There's some big word, facultative, that you guys, scientists, use all the time. I never use it. They can sort of sense that the season is advanced a little bit, and they can move up from South Carolina or up towards Concord pretty fast. But other birds later in the season, insectivorous birds later in the season, some of them don't really go up just 100 miles or 200 miles a day and maybe hang around and move up a little bit. They banded a gray-cheeked thrush somewhere in the Santa Marta Mountains of Colombia on a Tuesday morning, and that bird, and they have little tracking devices on the birds now, was found outside of Toronto, Canada, Thursday morning. It flew nonstop across the entire Caribbean, across Florida, across all the United States, and didn't even stop until it got to Canada. So there are some interesting things going on there. But the deer thing is a really big problem here. It is affecting the wildflowers, but it's affecting the breeding bird populations also, because we don't have a rich and glorious understory of native shrubs anymore. We just got endless amounts of white pine, which is a monoculture that's really boring for birds, and an understory of ferns and huckleberries that the deer don't eat. The deer are managing the forests here in Concord. But anyways, I found this is fascinating stuff, and particularly interested in how eBird has been so useful to you people, and I look forward to seeing these results in the future. So anyways, I'm going to pass the mic on here, and I'm sure we'll have some more questions from the audience that might be very interesting and entertaining. I want to introduce now Professor David Swain, who teaches at the Southern New Hampshire University, teaches ornithology up there, an outstanding ornithologist, and here's David.
I should introduce Peter, but he's the one person in the room that needs no introduction. Peter made a lot of my points for me. I like the story that you're telling, but there's a story within the story. And the story within the story is, in fact, the quite distinct data set of long-distance migrants, what we call obligate migrants, that migrate and have for probably since the last glacial maximum, migrated on a pretty fixed schedule because they have to. They don't know what the conditions on the ground in, say, Concord are. And so they arrive still fairly predictably within a particular window of time. Baltimore oriole, for instance. Many flycatchers, even a short distance or a medium distance flycatcher like the eastern phoebe, have a fairly stubbornly predictable schedule. There is some evidence, I've read a paper, that phoebes in some areas have adjusted up to 4 days. And flycatchers are a particularly interesting group to study. But if we look at other birds, birds that we call facultative migrants that can actually make decisions based on the weather on the ground, on changing phenology, can respond to weather conditions. Actually, the story there is that they are arriving often dramatically earlier. In fact, so early some years that they are fooled. They are fooled because they are in a warm pool of early spring arrival in, say, Georgia or the Carolinas, and then they arrive in Massachusetts like woodcocks did this year. We had a pulse of woodcocks arrive mid-February, February 13th for woodcocks, thinking, this is our year. Yeah, we're gonna beat the house. And no, the house always wins. And so they disappeared, and they got taken out of the gene pool, so to speak, by a pretty cruel march. And this happens over and over again. The story within the story is how variability in climate change is inducing phenological change to our south that is encouraging fairly erratic, but often radically early bird arrival times. I've cautioned our presenters here about the first date of arrival, often simply because we're trying to merge a very large data set, the eBird data set, with single observers who simply can't get out every day, probably because there's 3 feet of snow on the ground, still in 1870 or something like that. But data sets are really hard if we have single observers in a different era. But we also have very large groups of very knowledgeable and scientifically curious birders. eBirders know about climate change. eBirders know about phenological mismatch. And so they're going out and they're looking for birds. So they have a very different search strategy in many ways than historic birders do, and there's simply more of them. I had one question. One of the other interesting things that you brought up was the phenological mismatch between trees and wildflowers. Is this a question of pollination? I'm wondering about pollinators, and particularly the disproportionate importance of pollinators on wildflowers and trees. I think there's another story in there that could also be told. I'm going to pass this over to
Hi again, I'm Jeff Collins. I am the Senior Director of Conservation Science at Mass Audubon, and again, pleased to be part of this panel. I remember seeing, and I think, Peter, you were probably at this presentation at the Nuttall Ornithological Club by Abe Miller-Rushing and Dr. Primack 15 years ago, maybe, on some of the initial work. So I appreciate everyone here's decades of work pursuing these questions. It's fascinating. At Mass Audubon, we obviously have over a century of history studying birds and celebrating birds and connecting people with birds. But we pay attention to a lot more than birds and think of birds as our, sort of the canaries in the coal mine and the umbrella of so many other ecological systems that we're looking to protect. And when we think about things like phenological mismatch and the changes that we are seeing and will continue to see, I think of solutions. How are we going to enact conservation actions to support birds and other plants and other wildlife through those changes? And we focus on building and maintaining resilient landscapes. A lot of people use the term resilience when we talk about responding to climate change and land conservation, and it can be confused with resistance. Let's build systems that won't change despite disturbance. But I think of resilience more as building a system that is capable of changing in response to disturbance while maintaining its essential functions and structures. So even though there's this phenological mismatch, do we have adequate diversity for birds in this case to find what they need to continue their migration, their breeding period, et cetera, and make it through that, that change in the abundance or availability of their historic food supply by finding some alternative food supply. So that's sort of on the theoretical phase. What can we do here in Concord, and folks joining from nearby towns or virtually from other communities, think through opportunities and decisions we're making in communities to restore wetlands, to maintain and invest in habitat management in fields, to postpone mowing in fields so invertebrates and birds can complete their life cycle. In West Concord, here in Concord, we'll be thinking about removing a small dam at Warner's Pond. There's a lot of historic and aesthetic connection to Warner's Pond, but think of the aquatic invertebrates that will be bred off of a cooler, free-flowing stream, and the fish that will build up and ultimately support birds and other wildlife. So we're focused a lot on taking into consideration the historic land use, recovery of some species, decline of other species, focusing on building resilience across the landscape so that birds and other wildlife can figure things out as best they can. We like to say they're professional birds. They can do it if we give them a chance.
Hi, I'm Kathy Dia. I'm a local birder and part-time at Mass Audubon leading bird walks. So Peter and David mostly talked about what I was going to talk about, which is the mismatch between the long distance migrants and the short distance. And just to clarify about why that is, the long distance migrants are going by length of day as to when they think it's time to migrate, and obviously that doesn't change. I just thought I'd ask a question, which is, would it be interesting to study mean arrival data rather than, first arrival data, obviously you could have complete outliers. It's interesting how much it matched up though over the years. There really was a nice match there. And you don't have mean arrival data for those earlier researchers, right, like Thoreau. But now with eBird data, you could study that from 1990 to 1923. Is that something of interest at all? Yeah.
Yeah, this is the eBird status and trends tools, which they're beginning to actually extend historically.
This is a long distance migration of the microphone. So absolutely, this is something that that we think a lot about in phenology research is what are the benefits of using something like the first day of arrival versus the mean day of arrival, or even looking at the whole distribution. And when we are taking just one first arrival date from these eBird data, we have to throw out a whole lot of really rich information. And so I will say, we have for eBird, at this point, the richest data for Concord is about a decade old. And so we're able to see some trends within that, but ideally we'll sort of get a little bit more data. And this is sort of what's coming out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology too, is that they're really excited for what happens in the next 5 years or 10 years of eBird data. But taking that first date for now really allows us to extend this long-term data set and compare it to the historical data. But the short answer is yes, absolutely, we want to look at those mean dates as well and see, as we continue monitoring birds into the future, to look at the whole season. Yeah.
So I think at this point we want to be able to have some time where people in the audience can ask questions or make comments, and also potentially have people who are on Zoom ask questions via the chat feature. Does that sound okay, Allison?
Sounds great. And if you could repeat what the audience asked. Just
Okay. So would anyone from the audience like to ask a question or make a comment? Yes? Can you start off by saying your name?
My name is Gwyn Loud, a birder from Lincoln, and I'm concerned about the general decline in insects. So my question, two questions. One is your lab, is anybody studying, I'm sure somebody is, the emergence of insects and the change in timing by climate, but also are people studying the effect on birds? Because if the insects have emerged, or hatched, whatever they're doing, earlier, we all know that baby birds need to be fed caterpillars. Now, if those caterpillars are emerging earlier, what is the impact on the birds for changes in insect appearance?
So I think the people heard the question because you were speaking on the microphone. Okay, that's fine. Do you want to answer that? Sure. Okay.
Do you want to?
Do I hand this? So there's been a huge amount of research on the possible mismatch between insect phenology and bird phenology. There are some reports from Europe that this might be having a very strong effect on flycatchers in Europe. But it's actually very difficult to study this, especially in North America, because birds aren't just eating one kind of insect, they're eating a lot of different kinds of insects. So if they're out of sequence with one insect, they just might switch to another kind of insect. Also, there's this general phenomenon that many of you have heard about a general insect decline. And there's just overwhelming evidence now really throughout the world, both in the tropics and in the temperate zone and in North America, that the abundance of insects is declining, that when there are long-term studies of insect abundance, we find that the abundance of insects is much lower now than it was in the past. And so this means the basic food which feeds birds in the spring of insects is actually less. And so people are investigating now whether the lack of insects is one of the factors which contributes to the decline in bird populations. But the evidence really isn't in yet, but it's a very, very active area of research right now.
Can I add?
Yes, you can. Then maybe Peter.
Thanks so much. So Richard sort of brought this up within his answer, story within a story, and Jeff also mentioned earlier about sort of insect diversity and the impact that can have. So plant diversity begets insect diversity, which begets bird diversity. And so what researchers at Hubbard Brook are finding as they're looking at insect phenology over the course of the season in New Hampshire, that's right. So what they're finding when they're looking at whether we see the same sort of pulse of say, caterpillar abundance as has been seen in some of these examples of mismatch in Europe, where they've connected the mismatch between birds and caterpillars to population declines. So trying to see whether the same thing is true here in New England is that when we have a diversity of insects, we don't see that really strong pulse in the spring. So the more diversity of insects, the more their phenology varies, and the more likely we are to avoid a mismatch because we don't have that really strong pulse of a single species that the birds could miss. And so when we think about conservation strategies, one of the things that we really want to keep in mind is the biodiversity. So making sure that we're maintaining some biodiversity of plants that can support a diversity of insects that reduces the likelihood of that mismatch. We've also found in the autumn, sorry, I'll just add one more because autumn is my favorite season, that when we have, that increasingly birds are migrating a little bit later in the autumn, which puts them in sort of greater contact with invasive fruits. But when there are native fruits around, the birds will eat them, and they have higher nutritional quality than those invasive fruits. And so, again, we see a benefit for birds of planting native plant species and maintaining them.
Just briefly, that invasive plant thing is very important on the insect issue. Most of these plants come from Eastern Asia, and the insects that fed on those over in Asia have not come over here in most cases. And so there's like no caterpillars on ailanthus, there's no caterpillars eating oriental bittersweet leaves. And that's really reducing the food supply as invasive plants take over more and more and more of our areas. So it's a big problem. Also, just one little asterisk here. Some of you, Henry Thoreau, back in his day, he never saw tufted titmouse, he never saw Carolina wrens, and all these other southern birds like cardinals that are up here. None of them are migratory. If you're born in Concord, your babies may go to Carlisle to breed, and then the Carlisle ones to Chelmsford, but they're not going to South America. But the interesting thing to check on right now is some southern birds that are expanding their range northward that Henry didn't know. Little things like blue-gray gnatcatchers, which most of you have never seen before, never bred around here. Henry never saw them. We have an increase, a northward trend now of little things called Acadian flycatchers, prothonotary warblers, of which there's a couple in Concord right now, and other southern birds of the summertime that have nothing to do with bird feeders or multiflora rose, which is the only reason we have mockingbirds here. But there's a lot of trends here, and that invasive alien plant crisis is real. If any of you have a backyard, you know about it. It provides a lot of fruit in the fall, but no nutrition for baby birds, which need insect protein in June. It provides nothing, and this is an increasing problem, which is another downward trend for our birds. Thank you for more questions.
Another question? Go ahead.
I was just wondering about parasitic birds, like brown-headed cowbird, and whether they're in lockstep with their host, or if they've been differentially affected by climate change.
Since this is the last question, I'll let Amanda answer that one.
I was going to ask if anyone else on the panel has an answer for that question. I would have to look into that, Les. Thanks it's a good question.
Complex question. One way to answer that is brown-headed cowbirds now winter here. They didn't in the past, so they have real advantages. Second, even though we're reforesting a lot, we don't reforest with really, really good interior forest density. And even in Estabrook Woods, fairly far in Estabrook Woods, I find brown-headed cowbirds. So their penetration into areas where they're not supposed to be, they're not just edge predators, but they've gotten quite good at it, at using somewhat species depleted landscapes like we're reforesting. So again, this goes back to species richness. You know, most of our forests are, you know, really typical, and they're all becoming hardwood as trees are also migrating northward. The joke nowadays, particularly this year, is we're becoming New Jersey. You know, what's going to be next? That kind of thing. Fish crows and, you know, Acadian flycatchers and stuff like that. We're getting a lot of southern species. And so the brown-headed cowbird thing is a really, really interesting thing, and I haven't answered your question. I suspect their success is very localized, but anecdotally, they seem to be doing pretty well. Yeah.
And I'll note that Estabrook Woods is one of the sites that we're using, so please continue to submit your eBird checklist.
Brown-headed cowbird, of course, is not native to New England. It was a bird out in the Buffalo Plains. It was called a buffalo bird when they ran into it, and we cleared every tree from here to Omaha. They came east, and our birds, other than yellow warblers and a few other things, have a strategy. But each female cowbird is capable of laying one egg in 40 different nests, 40 different songbird nests a year, and that baby cowbird elbows out its siblings and takes all of the food. And that's why wood thrushes in some areas, 90% of the nests only raise one cowbird baby.
Yeah, but we do have breeding bird surveys now by looking for cowbirds.
And a good trivia question, if you ask a hardcore birder, what common summer bird here in New England's nest has never been found?
I think that's it. Thank you so much, Richard and Amanda, and then our panelists, Peter, David, Jeff, and Kathy. Thank you, everyone on eBird, everyone here tonight. Lots of people to thank, so thank you.